Hello, I'm Sally Hogg, and this is the Mobilise podcast from the Centre for Research on Play in Education, Development and Learning at the University of Cambridge. Mobilise is a mini-series in which I talk to leading policymakers and politicians from across the UK about how research can be used in policy to improve children's lives. We'll be finding out about the things our guests have achieved for children and about the challenges that arise when trying to use research-based evidence in complex political environments. If you've got any interest in research, child development and children's policy, then this is a podcast for you. Today I'm pleased to be talking to Sir Peter Wanless. Peter is the CEO of the children's charity, the NSPCC, a role he's held for over a decade. Prior to that, he was chief executive of the Big Lottery Fund. The NSPCC works to prevent child abuse and to protect children from harm through direct service provision and campaigning for changes to government policy and public attitudes. Peter's role means he spends time offering expert advice to government and working publicly and privately to influence policy across the 4 nations of the UK. As we approach a UK general election, Peter is joining other charity chief executives to persuade both the government and the opposition to make children more central to their policy priorities. Like many of our guests, Peter has seen children's policy from both inside and outside of government. He started his career in the UK government, where he was private secretary to 3 cabinet ministers, and then held senior positions in the Department for Education and the Department for Children, Schools and Families as it became, including Director of Secondary Education and Director of Strategy and Communications. Welcome, Peter. It's lovely to see you.
Thanks very much, Sal. Good to be here.
So you've had a varied career in government, as I've just been talking about, and in the charity sector. Looking back at all that you've achieved for children over that time, what are you proudest of?
Oh, gosh. I think probably the way in which the NSPCC has rolled out its Speak Out, Stay Safe service into pretty much every primary school, the length and breadth of the UK. So having spent a considerable amount of time in the Department for Education, I'm deeply sceptical of initiatives and ideas which all sorts of well-meaning people push on incredibly busy schools who only have so many hours in the day to engage with and inspire and connect with their pupils. So to create something which the overwhelming majority of primary schools really value and welcome in as a contribution to learning, there's no obligation or requirement for schools to take this service, is something special. So I think it speaks to the authority and the kind of real world relevance which we can bring to entry-level, age-appropriate conversations with young children about how to stay safe from abuse and neglect. So the ubiquity of that service, I think, is lovely to see. And there's nothing quite as exhilarating as hearing a load of 5 to 7-year-olds all shouting out with great confidence, I have the right to be happy and safe. And you sort of feel if they could hold on to that self-confidence and belief in themselves through their childhood, then the world would be a better place.
Oh, what a lovely image to start with. Can you tell us a bit more about that service? What is Speak Out, Stay Safe?
So it is designed to help primary age children understand what is appropriate and what is inappropriate adult behaviour and what to do if they have a worry or a concern. So in age appropriate language, we talk about physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, neglect and bullying, and create this sort of notion of a safe adult and help children understand that if they're not sure there's a safe adult in their life, then Childline is here for them, which is a service which the NSPCC runs 24/7 for children with nowhere else to turn. So it was originally designed for 9 to 11-year-olds, but as time has gone by, each time people say, can't you do this for younger ones? So it's now available for 5 to 7s, and we're even, looking at developing reception age experiences and helping parents themselves, not just in schools, have conversations about how young people can be aware of and alive to the threat of abuse, so that it becomes as natural a kind of conversation to have as the Green Cross Code is when it comes to teaching kids how to cross the road safely.
As you say, I mean, people listening to this podcast working in education will think, wow, how have they managed that to roll something out across schools? Because it's an ambition that lots of people working on interventions or education programs will be thinking about. What do you think has been the active ingredient or the process, the implementation learning that's enabled you to reach that scale?
Well, I think understanding context is everything. So listening to and connecting with children and young people themselves to understand their perspective and their world, and then to be offering something that is in a sensitive area that perhaps, however brilliant a classroom teacher is, they didn't necessarily enter the profession to have the first conversation with little children about how to stay safe from sexual abuse. Actually, we've been developing these concepts out into secondary education now, and looking at, through a program called Talk Relationships, how we can improve the quality and relevance of discussions that teenagers have about consent. So if you talk to young people, they will tell you about all sorts of awkward and embarrassing lessons and discussions which take place in school around issues of sex education and consent. There are some brilliant ones, of course, and some teachers who are expert in all of this, but generally speaking, the kind of confidence to learn those things well and broach those conversations for the first time can benefit from an injection of expertise and insight from people who thought about this stuff from first principles, are confident about it, and have a real kind of knowledge and understanding of where young people themselves are coming from.
You've talked about there how you're bringing together kind of the insights from children and young people themselves and that professional experience. Is academic evidence or research evidence playing a role in this or in other programs that you're running at NSPCC as well?
Yeah, definitely. I was attracted to come to the NSPCC in the first place because I think it is it's an organisation which puts learning front and centre. I mean, whether that is access to research and insight and understanding around child protection, or knowledge and understanding of cutting edge practice either in this country or overseas. All of this is really important in the mix when it comes to thinking about how we design and test our services. If I reflect on what we're able to develop and deliver ourselves at the NSPCC compared with what I was able to commission when I was a civil servant, I'd say that there are two differences at the NSPCC. Neither of them make us, better or worse. They're just different. So we're overwhelmingly funded from voluntary donations. So that gives us the opportunity to take risks and experiment and try things out that it's very difficult to do if you are a statutory service. And secondly, we can spend proportionately more on research and evaluation and learning from what we do. So I like to think of us as a research and development arm, if you like, for child protection across the UK. People think of us as a big charity. We're actually tiny in relation to the scale of the problem. So it's not enough, to my mind, for us simply to dispense random acts of kindness, however well researched, to small numbers of people who are fortunate enough to be touched by our service. The real prize comes if we can test and learn and evidence and then inform the system more broadly as to what is possible. So taking some of that risk out of innovation, which is very difficult to do when you're working in a statutory service with huge caseloads and immense pressures and legal obligations to respond to children in situations of crisis day after day.
I mean, there's a really inspiring sort of mission and vision there for the charity around taking those risks, doing that innovation work, but also evidencing it. How common do you think that is across? Is the NSPCC unique, or is that quite common across charities to think about themselves having that research generating and learning role?
I think it's becoming more common for good and less good reasons. Lots of charitable organisations are resource constrained and under huge pressure, and what we could supply is so out of kilter with the demand that it's really important that organisations like ours take very careful decisions about where and how we can make the greatest difference. So I think the NSPCC was early to this, but increasingly you will find, I think, organisations like ours asking very carefully, what do we do, what do we enable, and what do we influence? And as resources become ever more constrained, what you actually do yourself, that's the most expensive bit, if you like, of the portfolio of what charities such as ours can do. But it's really important to retain the ability and insight to do at least some of that, because I think that gives us real credibility when it then comes to enabling and influencing beyond what we're doing ourselves. So we have narrowed our delivery focus as an organisation over time, as resources have become more constrained, but also I think as we have appreciated that it is incredibly challenging to influence, practice and embed it well beyond what the charity does itself, because you really have to have excellent relationships and knowledge and understanding of context beyond the places that you're delivering services directly yourselves. So at the moment, in terms of what we do, we focus particularly on the youngest children, particularly children who are babies, who are growing up in a context where they could be facing multiple risks. And we concentrate secondly on sexual abuse and the prevention of sexual abuse. So we're having to make tough choices, actually, about where we focus, because if we try and run everything in an undifferentiated fashion, we're not going to have that, either the quality of the direct impact we seek or the influence based on evidence well beyond, as I say, what we're able to do ourselves.
NSPCC's always had a great influence and power just by the sort of hearts and minds argument and the kind of the history of campaigning that the charity's done based on just showing how awful child abuse can be. I wonder if you can reflect on where the kind of academic evidence of the scale of the issue or the impact on children or what works, how that plays into your role in terms of being able to influence policymakers and politicians.
Yeah, so we've done a lot of research and evidence into public understanding and public appreciation of our issue and what motivates people to get involved and to make a difference, whether that's through their own personal actions to keep children safe or through donating time or money to support us in our endeavours. And actually banging on and on about the scale of the problem can lead people, research will tell us, can lead people into a fatalistic swamp of believing that nothing actually ever can change. So there was a moment in time when that was vitally important to raise understanding and appreciation of both the nature and the prevalence of the abuse and neglect of children. But now it's increasingly important, if we're going to achieve our charitable purpose of preventing cruelty to children, that we can inspire and enable lots more people to get involved. So research would tell us that really effective positioning and campaigning for the NSPCC in this space needs to hit three particular buttons. So one is, if we can appeal to a sense of collective endeavour and collective responsibility. So you are not alone in the efforts and endeavours to help keep children safe. So creating or joining some sort of a movement for change or sense of people with a shared belief in the importance of this issue matters. Secondly, creating a sense of urgency. So we don't want the fatalism, but we do want people to understand why it's essential that children are better protected now than is currently the case. And thirdly, to demonstrate that there are solutions, there are practical steps which people can take themselves, directly or indirectly, to make things better than they would otherwise be the case. So all of that is grounded in pretty deep research about attitudes and behaviours when it comes to the abuse and neglect of children, and what a campaigning charity can best do to encourage active steps as opposed to passive appreciation.
Thank you. I'd like to take you back a bit now, Peter, to talk about when you were in government and the work you did there. And we're thinking a lot in this podcast about how research and evidence influences government. Can you think about when you were working in the Department for Education, the Department for Children, research evidence that really informed policy during that time?
We used to joke about policy-based evidence making. I think the strength of policy desire from ministers was sometimes stronger than starting with the research. I did a lot on schools policy and how to influence outcomes that schools were achieving. And there was a lot of research about what motivates school leaders and teachers in the classroom to do the best they can for young people. And there was some very powerful work done around what became known as families of schools. So identifying schools that had pupils with similar intakes and prior levels of achievement, and then illustrating the differential impacts that could be achieved with those children over time. So it was trying to create a sort of sense of competition between schools, but in a way that appealed to the strong moral purpose and sense of appreciation that teachers in the classroom had of one another and their determination to do better. So rather than competing for admissions with the school that happened to be down the road, find schools where the geography was not quite so proximate, but where different contexts were achieving different outcomes for children, and then get those teachers talking to one another about what it was that was enabling some of them to live better for kids than others, and that became a really important part of the London Challenge, which over time has really transformed outcomes for children and young people in education across London. So for me, that was an example of insight about human and professional motivations and behaviours being allied to data and evidence to create really, positive momentum that brought energy from competition, as opposed to quite often you hear in education about competition, sapping energy as people compare their inspection results or the number of pupils they've attracted to the school. So that for me would be one example of research informing practice, influencing outcomes to the benefit of children.
Yeah, interesting. And it links back to what you were saying earlier about avoiding fatalism. I guess if you've got schools that are in very disadvantaged areas, then there can be that feeling that maybe their results can't improve. But if you can show them those statistical neighbours, those families of schools with similar demographics who are turning the curve, then there's some inspiration from that. We spoke to Beverly Hughes for one of these podcasts who talked about the teenage pregnancy policy, and that used a very similar approach of saying, well, we can find areas who've got similar demographics, similar things going on for their young people, but some are still doing better on this measure than others, and let's learn from that.
Yes, and appeal to people's both it's a professional and moral sense of purpose to engage constructively with one another. That does work well.
I was interested in your kind of reflection on the policy-based evidence making, and that the kind of tension between where you've got politicians who want to or need to drive a particular agenda, and then potentially evidence that might show something different. And I wonder if you had any reflections on how you navigated some of that as a civil servant.
I could tell you a funny story about Ed Balls and Dolly Parton, where this apparently was the most important, the high point of my civil service career, according to Lady W, when I got to meet Dolly Parton, who came into the Department for Children, Schools and Families because she had through her charity, she was giving away thousands and thousands of books to new families. And she had created an agreement with Rotherham where this was happening. Now, what's not to like about free books for babies, except that actually in Sure Start, we had constructed a kind of context in which parents were not only getting free books, but they were getting them in the context of a relationship which was thinking really carefully about how to develop and support the babies in the environment they were growing up in. And this was actually more cost effective and better for child outcomes than posting thousands of books to addresses, many of which meant that the books never arrived. Some of the books went straight on eBay. So actually, what Dolly was seeking to do was very positive, but we were pretty confident, having thought about this, there was a better way of doing it. So I had to write a brief for Secretary of State Ed Balls to say, it's wonderful that Dolly's coming to see us. She's got this great idea, but don't be so starstruck as to think that it's the best thing that can be done with a limited amount of money. So I thought, if I don't write this brief on one side of A4, and if I'm not extremely clear about what the absolute bottom line is, this could end up costing us quite a lot of money, and cut across what Sure Start was seeking to do. Well, within 2 minutes of Dolly arriving, Ed Balls had tumbled out every single line right through to the absolute at the bottom of the page. If you must go this far and no further. And then we had to survive sort of 28 minutes of small talk because he'd nowhere else to go. But fair play to him, he held the line. So that was an example of evidence-based policy making, holding the line. And at the end, both Ed and I got a very nice selfie with Dolly Parton.
Well, we've talked about the competing pressures, but we didn't quite think about Dolly Parton as one of those pressures not to stick with the evidence. But that's a great story. Thank you for sharing that one. Do you think over time, you worked for a number of different governments, and then you've worked closely from outside government with different administrations. Do you think there's been a change in the weight that evidence has been given over time?
I don't know. I probably yes. I think evidence is still trumped by available resource. And unfortunately, what we often see is evidence leading to decisions to do something quite wise, but on a small scale and for a limited amount of time. and that then runs out and we go back to first principles or start again. So if you look across the children's sector at the moment, there are so many pots and plans and time-limited experiments of one kind or another that have evidence that support them to a degree, but which have been constrained by the money that happens to be available for particular periods of time. And I think my main concern with this whole space is that for all the kind of imagination and inventiveness and experimentation, that doesn't in the end constitute system reform. And at some point, we could and should, step back from all these rather fragmented experiments or partial implementations of pathfinders in the response to the social care review, or mental health practitioners in a small number of schools, and say what works for the system as a whole. We haven't got there nationally. The closest I feel I've got to it professionally is the work which we have been doing in Blackpool for Blackpool Better Start, funded by the lottery over a 9-year period, where we do have governance and decision-making arrangements across the town there through a board which the NSPCC chairs, which is designed to require us to take decisions in the best interests of the -6 months to 3-year-olds in the Better Start wards. And that has led the town together, by which I mean not just the NSPCC and the council and the hospital and the police, but local businesses, the local community themselves, all to come together and work out the best collective outcomes for babies and young children. And that's been exciting and refreshing, and it has required some investment, but actually it's the governance and decision-making arrangements that I think are especially powerful and have led to joined up thinking that it's much more difficult to do on a larger scale.
I wonder if there's something there around there's all of this evidence about particular interventions or services, and it can be easy for central government to get wrapped up in that and think about how do we get this happening. But actually the role for central government perhaps isn't to think at that level of interventions, but think about how do we create systems that enable local places like Blackpool to then choose their evidence-based practice and implement it in a way that works for them on a sustained basis. So actually changing that role of national government, not to get too much into the detail of practice, but to think about creating systems that then enable that.
Yeah, very much so. I think that is that's the way to go, and it should be obliged and required for the local partnerships to draw from knowledge and understanding of what works well and what works less well, but how those things are then adopted and adapted to connect with local context, I do think is important.
And how does that feel as a campaigning charity when you want to say to national government, actually, you need to create these local partnerships with the right accountability, which is a far less sexy campaign call than asking for a specific service for children in a specific place?
There can still be specific services and specific characteristics which will we can demonstrate are far more likely to work than others, but it is so much is in the execution and the implementation. And that's a journey that the NSPCC has been on from, when you and I were working together 10 years ago, and we were looking at sourcing, real high fidelity, high potential services of one kind or another, through to proportionately thinking much more now about implementation and execution, and creating the conditions and the capability in which those sorts of services can be adopted, implemented, modified at the margin. It's important. As the 5 main children's charities in the run-up to this election, we have decided not to call for a sort of shopping list of initiatives, but to emphasise instead the vital importance of children and young people themselves being at the table and having an appreciation and an understanding of what they are thinking and feeling in order to make better policy. And I think that remains a frustration to me as well, that too many services are blind to the particular context of babies, children, and young people, and are just designed by adults for adults and delivered down administrative silos that don't really appreciate or understand how these things come together, particularly for families under strain.
Yeah, and I think over the last decade, we've seen some of the silos developing again in central government, where bits of children are seen separately, and perhaps as a result of some of the really powerful evidence showing the long-term impacts of intervening in childhood, we've almost forgot childhood itself, that actually we talk about working with children in order to prevent them becoming service users or unemployed or whatever it might be. So it's great to see children back in their own right being valued. In the conversations you're having with the government and opposition, are you seeing those arguments getting traction? Do you think there will be change?
One of my main priorities at the moment, if there is to be a Labour government, which most of the polls would suggest there will be, is to argue that in the discussions that Keir Starmer is having about his missions for government, babies, children and young people are explicitly called out as a factor to be considered and outcomes measured against in relation to those missions. So there is the potential in that way of thinking to insert babies, children and young people into the heart of what that government says it intends to drive forward from the centre. So I think there's potential to deliver in a better and more joined up way. Let's see what the manifesto says. It would be lovely to see that sentence in there. In terms of the Conservative government and where they are at the moment, I struggle to see that explicit focus on children. There's some really good work that has been done in the context of the independent care review, and following through on that is important. The independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, again, made some really important and far-reaching recommendations. So I think this government has asked some really big and really important questions for and on behalf of babies, children and young people. It's a question of stepping back and following through on some of that, and reminding them of what the analysis has suggested needs to be done, as opposed to going back to first principles and doing that work again. So if the will is there, there's potential to build on there. It's a question of finding sufficient champions for children, I think, in the in a new parliament to take some of this stuff forward.
Yeah, and great that you're working with the other children's charities to be that united voice. Yeah, that's so important. We've got time for one more question, Peter, and I just want to take you back to thinking about research, because obviously we're doing this as an academic centre. What do you think are the big questions about early childhood that we still need to answer in order to think about, as a system, being able to improve children's lives and life chances?
Yeah, I'd definitely like to see further research on the impact of the cost of living crisis on the youngest children. So the stress associated with poverty can affect a parent's interactions with their child, and these interactions have an important impact on their child's well-being and development. So the work that Sir Michael Marmot in particular has done to highlight that inextricable link between poverty and health feels important. So how researchers can add to the body of evidence that will help us make the case against economic measures and welfare reforms that particularly harm children feels important. There's still much that we don't know about resilience and what must happen in the early years to help children to be better able to weather traumatic events. So understanding what we can do, not just as parents, but collectively as communities and wider society to help build generations of resilient children feels another big question. So there's a couple of large ones.
Yeah, that'll keep us busy for a while. Brilliant. Thank you, Peter. And I think also reflecting on that we often see, maybe in research, that kind of siloed thinking between interventions on one hand and kind of poverty research on the other, but thinking about actually collectively for a government, how are they balancing the pressures on families and the support available to them, is important to think about. It's been fantastic to talk to you. Thank you very much for your time and for sharing your insights and expertise and anecdotes with us. Before we go, I'd just like to remind our listeners that if you enjoyed listening to this conversation with Peter, please do check out the other podcasts in our series, which you can find on whichever platform you get your podcasts. And please tell your colleagues about the Mobilise podcast too. Mobilise is a mini-series created by the Centre for Research on Play in Education and Development and Learning here at the University of Cambridge. For more information about Pedal and to access our wider resources, please visit our website, pedalhub.net. Thank you for listening.